Do you have SIBO and want to learn how to help yourself? The SIBO Success Plan is now available from thesibodoctor.com. In this highly anticipated plan, you'll learn my tried and proven method to treat SIBO, including home treatments, online dispensary guides, diet handouts, and much, much more. Already being treated by a practitioner? No problem. The SIBO Success Plan is designed as a standalone program or to work under the care of a practitioner. Become a SIBO-savvy patient and beat SIBO for good. For more info, go to www.thesibodoctor.com. Welcome back to part 2 of the SIBO Doctor podcast, and let's jump right back into it. We've arrived at the methane topic, and that's really, it's a good segue into that. I'm myself very fascinated with methane because it seems to be a different situation than the situation that you just described, where we have a case of food poisoning that then results in an overgrowth of these proteobacteria because of a damaged motility issue. Now, as far as I understand it, also looking at your research into this matter, methane operates very differently. Is that right? Like, we don't really see the history of food poisoning as much with methane-dominant SIBO as we see with just pure hydrogen.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I mean, occasionally patients with methane will test positive, for example, on the IBS Smart, but it's much lower. I wouldn't, or I would be incorrect to recommend doing IBS Smart as a way of diagnosing constipation IBS or methane overgrowth. So it's different. It's a different animal. And that's why we think the C part of, or constipation part of IBS, where methane is predominant, or constipation in general, where methane is predominant. The mechanism of that is unclear, except we think methane blooms or is overgrown in the intestinal tract. And again, methane's a little different too, because it isn't necessarily the small bowel only. There's colonic excess of methane too. So that everything is a little bit different there. But methane is a problem. The amount of methane you produce correlates with the amount of constipation you have, and that's really important because it's proportional. It's cause and effect with methane.
Right, and yet we have many people who would be considered positive on a breath test that don't have constipation, and we have all these odd things, like naturally we are more higher in this archaea as we age, and also an entire continent Africa is like massively methane dominant. So I just wonder if there are other factors that determine whether or not a patient will become constipated under those circumstances, because many people do not have constipation even though methane levels are high.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of circumstances and maybe locations of where the methane is. Yes, I mean, I've spoken about this many times about, African populations having higher methane, but you think about what people are eating in different parts of the world. So there may be less meat consumption, more fiber material consumption in sub-Saharan African diets than in Western diets, where it's all meat all the time. And so that may dictate some of the problems that we see, because fiber may offset the constipating effects of methane, or it may change some of the physiology. We're not sure how that all works. But what I can tell you is that, for example, in African American populations, and we see this in our clinic, methane is very high and very constipating. So, but we think methane, though, or the methanogens actually are acquired from your environment more. So we see methane run in families. Like if a father has methane, the daughter or son or both may have methane, and it's maybe casual contact that determines the colonization more so than others. And the reason we know that even more so from data is Suarez is a author from Brazil, and they showed that the proximity of living close to a sanitation facility, or a dump, as we call it here in the U.S., where your garbage or trash is dumped, are more likely to have methane than people who live in more affluent areas. So again, it's an environmental, we think, colonization.
But getting back to the sub-Saharan Africans and this whole fiber idea, it was always, as you've mentioned many times before in previous symposiums, that it is thought to be an evolutionary advantage, right, to actually have had Methanobrevibacter on board because it would slow digestion so you could extract more calories from very undigestible fibers. So maybe, it's not really a pathogen per se. I mean, it isn't. It's not a pathogen. It's just something that we find very much correlated. And that's the mystery to me, is like, are there other colonic circumstances or small intestinal circumstances that then lead to constipation with methane? Because it seems like everything we find out about the microbiome, there is so much interrelationship between different phyla and different situations that it wouldn't surprise me at all that we find a specific circumstance that would lead Methanobrevibacter to become more constipating in some than others.
Yes, you're preaching to the choir on that. That is exactly how I feel about all of this. I mean, think about it. The microbiome are in balance with you. They want you to survive because you're providing food for them by running around and eating things, and so there's a harmony between the diet and the human and their microbiome. I think in populations in Africa or in situations where there's more feast and famine, methanogens are a competitive advantage. So you are actually superhuman by having methanogens, and it's a good thing. But in Western, if you move those populations west and there's potato chips on the desk or bagels in the back office all the time, and you're just eating all day and candy bowl in front of you, then having all these methanogens and you're harvesting so much energy so easily is not an advantage. It's a disadvantage. And I think, in the end, it's really a civilization problem. We just have grotesquely too much food in some parts of the world and undernourished in other parts of the world, and in the disadvantaged. But maybe nature takes care of the disadvantaged, and in the case of methane, in some strange but beautiful way.
Well, I also, after all these years in practice and having tested for methane, or at least breath testing for SIBO, and seeing the patterns and seeing people that have been on very restrictive diets for many years in many cases and sort of self-selected themselves for reducing their FODMAPs, etc., just to because they were told they have SIBO and it's a really methane dominant situation, let's say. I just haven't found that these people don't fit the picture of that they overconsume calories necessarily. They are restricting certain foods. They've tried every which way, and methane is just really hard. It's just, I find it, I think I get most success with my methane is when I just do much more of a comprehensive approach in terms of microbiome restoration in general. So, which is a whole nother topic, but I think it's just such a fascinating thing because we say these people have SIBO, and I guess my next question would be, since the North American consensus a couple of years ago that sort of set some guidelines in terms of breath testing interpretation, is there any further movement to perhaps even reclassify IBS-C as a different condition from SIBO altogether?
You need to stay tuned. There's some things I can't talk about yet because it's not published, but the answer is yes. Things need to be reclassified, and you should see some of that reclassification in the coming months. But I can't say more than that. I'm sorry.
That's really exciting because I'm just guessing. I was just guessing that something needs to happen because these people do not respond to the same approach that we use with other SIBO patients that are much more straightforward, high hydrogen, etc.
100% agree, and those things are starting to happen among the field. So very exciting times for everybody and for patients mostly. And I think that's the key, is that these patients were dismissed, thought of as psychological problems, but now we're really finding the true pathophysiology, and now we can get to the bottom of it and start to treat it. But I think with methane, you're absolutely right. It's a bane of my existence and patients' existence because it's the toughest one to treat. I would say that I'm seeing less and less D in the clinic than I used to, but I'm seeing more and more of these methane constipated patients because nothing seems to work well for them. So we're looking to try and change that game also.
Are you any closer with the SIN-10, the lovastatin?
Oh, much closer. So we're right now in the middle of a trial, the phase 2 trial, which is really exciting because we want, if this works, then it goes quickly to phase 3 and then to approval. So we're thrilled we're part of this trial and we're partly enrolled. For those who might have methane and are still struggling, we've just announced that we're paying for travel for people to come for the trial. It's 5 visits, but I'm certain that Australia would not qualify for the dollar amounts that we're talking about. But within the US, that's doable now. We're able to pay for some accommodation and travel to allow patients the opportunity to get into this trial.
All right. Let's see. We have about 15 minutes left in our very fascinating conversation. I have a few sort of questions about hydrogen sulfide. Of course, we were going to get to that. Everybody's waiting with bated breath on hydrogen sulfide and testing ability, but also the implications of what it really means. Can you just give us a little summary of what you've talked about this year?
So one of the things we've always known since the beginning of my research with understanding hydrogen and methane and breath testing, the irony of all of that breath testing is that people really didn't dig into the science, and we were never able to show that hydrogen was proportional to symptoms. So if your hydrogen is 150 or if it's 30, both are positive. But the 150 isn't necessarily sicker than the 30 or the 40. With methane, it's proportional. So the more methane you had, the sicker you were, the more constipation you had. The missing element was hydrogen sulfide. And so we helped to engineer a machine that can actually measure all the gases, and that machine is now created and is very shortly going to be able to provide that hydrogen sulfide missing element. But in the trials that we did, we showed that hydrogen sulfide really is the cause of diarrhea, or at least is associated with diarrhea. The higher the hydrogen sulfide, the more diarrhea you have. So for the first time, hydrogen sulfide is giving us an answer as to that third element. And there are no other gases. So this is sort of the complete picture now for the first time. And I'm looking forward to what patients' response is to all of this. And it could be the reason why certain antibiotics work and others don't. And it's going to open up a whole new area of trying to understand how to best treat these patients based on their gas profile.
So one quick question I have about hydrogen sulfide. It is the one gas that's also endogenously produced, though, right? So it's not only a measure of bacterial fermentation that probably definitely not to that degree that we would find it on a breath test. But I know that hydrogen sulfide can be also has been looked into as it has sort of a Goldilocks concentration where it can even exert a beneficial effect in low levels.
Yes. I mean, your gut can produce a little bit of hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a neurotransmitter. So tiny amounts are produced by the human body. The human body does not produce methane or hydrogen, but yes, hydrogen sulfide is a small byproduct. To counteract sort of those discussions is that we do have healthy controls, and the healthy controls do not have elevated hydrogen sulfide. They have detectable hydrogen sulfide, but not elevated. So it's really when the hydrogen sulfide is excessive from the gut that we start to see the illness part of this. Again, it's just another chapter that we will have a tool to start to unravel the subtleties and the nuances of this. But we know that from the studies that hydrogen sulfide in parts per million of more than 1.2 is associated with diarrhea. So that's going to be likely the cutoff for the final test. The other part of this is hydrogen sulfide is quite toxic as well in higher concentrations, as you know, or as most of your audience might know. Parts per million over 5 can kill humans. So it's not a good thing to have it at high concentrations in the body. And the liver detoxifies a lot of hydrogen sulfide. So the reason we get such small amounts on breath is because the liver is constantly trying to get rid of it, even what you produce in your body. So it detoxifies hydrogen sulfides. That's why you don't see 20, 30, 40 parts per million on the breath, even though locally in the gut, you might be producing a lot more than 1 or 2 parts per million.
That makes sense. A lot, and you and I had this conversation. I just thought I'd briefly touch on it. That, a lot of my research when I looked into hydrogen sulfide was more the colonic environment with desulfovibrio and those types of organisms in Bilophila that are very well-known hydrogen sulfide producers. But even in this sequencing that you're doing in the small intestine, I didn't really come across those bacteria. Are we any closer to knowing what bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide in hydrogen sulfide SIBO?
Yes, closer than you think.
Oh, God. This is always going to be like this, is it?
Because if it wasn't like this, it wouldn't be exciting, right? Because
it's true.
Because if we had all the answers, we would have nothing to talk about next year. But the point is, stay tuned for DDW 2020 because we
2020. Okay, and that's usually in May or something, right? May, June?
Yeah, May in Chicago, because we will be presenting some amazing data that I think will be very provocative for everybody and that will get us closer to those, lights at the end of the tunnel for all these different questions. And I think hydrogen sulfide is so fascinating and the results are unexpected. I love unexpected results because it's just, when you figure it out, it actually turns out to be more intuitive, but nobody realized how intuitive it was. But anyway, that's my little teaser. But stay tuned, and then we do a podcast.
Well, listeners, I have tried again and again. So we'll just have to keep waiting to hear what we're going to find out about hydrogen sulfide. Now, this is a total non sequitur, but I thought I'd ask it because it was something that I heard in one of the interviews. I think it was with Siobhan or so, where you talked about a test for vagal function. And, as integrative practitioners, we're really interested in the vagus nerve because of its massive function in digestive regulation, etc. And you talked about a test called the pancreatic polypeptide test, where food is chewed and spat out. And I just wondered how often it's used. And can you just talk just a minute about this test? Because it seems like, wow, if there's a test for vagal function that involves the pancreatic output or just a blood test, why are we not talking more about this?
I think the reason things are not spoken about as much, excuse me, is because these tests are so old that people have sort of forgotten about them. But these were tests that were, discovered or invented in the 70s and maybe even earlier. But basically, physiology is disappearing from medical teaching. And this is something I'm desperately trying to keep teaching our fellows so that they're more abreast of this. But basically, when you eat, there's various phases of eating. There's a cephalic phase. I'm thinking of food. The gut is already turning on. Now you're smelling food from the kitchen and you're already starting to think, oh, I got to eat. And then when you put it in your mouth, it really turns on the vagus nerves because you have to have the pancreas juice already being produced before you start eating. And the vagus nerve controls that. Pancreatic polypeptide is a very responsive sort of an intermediator marker that turns the pancreas on. And so it was discovered that if your vagi or vagus nerves were cut, you couldn't produce pancreatic polypeptide. It wouldn't go up. It would be there, but it wouldn't go up with that sort of anticipation of food. And the strongest provoker of pancreatic polypeptide is actually physically eating, but you can get pancreatic. So if I were to just have no vagus nerve and put food in the duodenum, pancreatic polypeptide would go up through local signaling. So you have to just chew it and spit it out. And that's the vagus nerve only. And it should go up by 50%. So if it starts at 100, it should go to more than 150 on the test. Over the period of measure. Usually it's an hour and a half to 2 hours. And
maybe that's why it's not so popular, because the patient has to sit there.
Yeah, and they have to have an IV and you have to draw blood every.
Yeah, okay. It's not as easy as I thought.
Yeah, it's not so easy. But it's really meant for people where they had some kind of surgery, or they had, and a recent one was, I saw a case report at the ACG where they did radio ablation of atrial fibrillation. So they did a cardiac procedure and they burned both vagus nerves, and then the patient was vomiting. And it was a vagal nerve dysfunction from that. So pancreatic polypeptide is a good way to test that.
Okay. Now, we're going to conclude the interview with a couple of questions that are in the category of how often do you and are we any closer to? Okay, so these can be just really fast little things. So, firstly, how often do you see a patient with diarrhea that has high methane on a breath test?
Very rarely. I can't give you the exact percentage, but I would say it's less than 5% easily.
Okay. How often do you relax for an entire weekend with your family?
Every weekend.
Do you?
I do take time off. On the weekdays, I'm working round the clock, but during the time with my family, my kids are now in college, but when my kids were all assembled, and my wife and I don't do research together, so there's more work at home. But 5:30, I was home. When the kids went to bed, I turned it on again. But the kids need my time, and that's important because family is critical.
Very critical. I just wondered because you're just every day you're somewhere else. Are we any closer to knowing accurately the percentage of IBS that is actually SIBO? Because there's figures 60 to 80%. That's a big difference.
It is a big difference. I think as we're getting closer and closer to defining what sequencing means SIBO equals SIBO, I think we're getting closer and closer to that answer. I think the best answer we have so far is the Pilaris study, PYLERIS. Pilaris is the first author. That study says 60%. And so I think I'm sort of settling on that for now. Breath testing can be as high as 80% in our trials that we've done in the past. So that's where the 60 to 80 comes from. But culture-wise, it looks like it's at least 60.
Okay. Is that like U.S. versus global?
Oh, that was an actual European study, so that wasn't even the U.S. study.
What about, are we any closer to having a sort of, maybe not consensus is the right word, but I still get a lot of complaints from people that go to their either GP or medical doctor or even their gastroenterologist and are told that SIBO doesn't exist. Are we any closer to that changing?
100%. I mean, the problem is primary care. I would hate to be primary care. Let me say it a different way. I would hate to be a primary care physician because primary care has, can you imagine the amount and volume of information they have to know to be able to understand the cutting edge of every facet of medicine? It's impossible. I mean, the amount and volume of inundation of data that they get. So they can't possibly keep up with the latest and greatest SIBO and so forth. What sometimes is disappointing is that gastroenterologists who, in 2019 should know food poisoning causes IBS and that SIBO is a big part of IBS because even the skeptics are saying that now. That's a little disappointing, and I'm sad for patients where they have that kind of experience. But you could say that if you get that kind of experience with a gastroenterologist, then maybe that gastroenterologist is up to date, not as well on everything, and reconsider. But those are my words of wisdom there.
Yeah, they're still coming in terms of, saying that they've been to their specialist and have the breath test was negated and they're still scheduled for colonoscopy. So, that's why I have so much respect for you besides the other aspects of your research, but really to try to reduce cost, or medical cost, for patients so that we have something a little bit more streamlined and cost effective for people that are looking for answers. So I thank you for that. And on that note, also, before we go, are you still seeing patients, or do they have to see your associates, or how do people find you?
So my practice is so inundated that I stopped seeing new patients. I just couldn't keep up with the patients I had existing already. So it's been really sad for me because I enjoyed the challenge of new patients, but I don't know what to do. I mean, it just the numbers just don't equate. I just can't keep up with the new patients. So unfortunately, but my colleagues are seeing news. We just hired a new person here at Cedars. So, and she's amazing. And so we're continuing to add experts that have the same skill set as I do to our group of doctors to try and see the patients.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Pimentel, any last nuggets of wisdom from you?
I'm just always happy to talk to you. I think I learn from, your questions and your ideas. And it sounds like every time you ask a question, it's the same question I'm asking here. So obviously, we're on the same wavelength in terms of what the patient needs. And thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time with us and look forward to talking to you at a next conference again. So thank you very much, Dr. Pimentel.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the SIBO Doctor podcast. We hope you found the information in this episode useful in the treatment of your SIBO patients. Thanks to our sponsors, SIBOtest.com, a breath testing service with easy online ordering, and Quintron, maker of outstanding breath testing equipment. Tune in again for another episode of the SIBO Doctor podcast. Thanks again for listening.